Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy. Good day, everybody. Welcome to Branches of Wisdom, the Banyan Books podcast. I'm your host, Ross McKeechee, and we have an excellent guest today, Mr. Bob McDonald, host of CBC's Quirks and Quarks. Very excited to be chatting with him. Before we get into our conversation, Banyan Books likes to acknowledge that although we have people joining from all over the world for these live streaming events, the physical location of Banyan Books and Sound is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Most of Banyan's podcasts and event series are free, and we welcome your donations to keep these programs accessible for all. Just go ahead and click on the PayPal link in the show description below. Towards the end of our conversation today, we'll take questions from the live audience for Bob McDonald. So go ahead and get ready to type your questions in for Bob throughout our conversation, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Our guest today has been the host of CBC Radio's Quirks and Quarks since 1992. He's also authored 6 books about science. But today he's with Banyan Books in conversation about a different kind of book. Just Say Yes, a memoir. Bob McDonald, beloved science reporter and radio host, has devoted a decades-long career to turning our attention away from everyday perspectives and outward to the vast, intricate wonders of our planet and universe. Now, in this revealing and captivating memoir, he looks within, offering an intimate view of the path that brought him from a blue-collar background to his long-standing role as Canada's foremost explainer of all things scientific. He's a regular science commentator on CBC News Network and science correspondent for CBC TV's The National. He's been honored with many awards, including the 2005 McNeil Medal for Public Awareness of Science from the Royal Society of Canada. In November 2011, McDonald was made an Officer of the Order of Canada. He's the recipient of 13, and I heard there might be a 14th honorary doctorate coming. And in 2014, asteroid 332324 was officially named Bob McDonald. Banyan community, join me in a warm welcome for Bob McDonald.
Thank you so much, Ross. Thank you. It's great to be here. And thank you for everyone for joining us this morning.
Oh, thanks for being here, Bob. It's really exciting to have you.
Coming to you live from Victoria, just across the Salish Sea here.
Oh, yes. Well, you've written quite a few books about science, and your career has been focused on bringing education about science to people. What made you want to switch gears and write a memoir at this point in your life?
Well, I'm always getting asked by people, what's your background? Where did you get your PhD? How did you end up hosting Quirks and Quarks? And when I tell them that I actually don't have a degree, I'm a university dropout. I come from a low-income, blue-collar family, and I was a construction worker after I dropped out of university. And they go, what? So how did this all happen? And I say, well, it came from saying yes to opportunities that were presented to me by family, by friends, mentors, who just said, hey, so-and-so is looking for someone. You'd be good at that. Why don't you give it a shot? And I said yes for some reason, even though I wasn't qualified to do any of those things. And one thing just led to another, and that's been the story of my life. So I thought I'd write it down in my book and try to give everybody that story of how I got. And if you like, I can give you just a couple of slides from the book and from my own archive to get us a little bit of a background. So that's the cover of the book. Just say yes. I'm not quite that handsome. I think they photoshopped that picture a little bit. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, next slide. This is me growing up in Orillia, which is a small town north of Toronto on the edge of cottage country. It's on a lake, Lake Couchiching. Our house was very close to it. And Orillia has a big park. Public park right on the lake. And that's how I spent my summers, was in and out of the water, running around like a feral kid. I spent the first 10 years of my life there growing up. Next slide. The reason I spent so much time outside, swimming in the summertime, sledding and tobogganing in the winter, is because my mother was the exact opposite of a helicopter parent. Her motto was, get out of the house. Don't bother me. Get out of the house. Go play. Come back when the street lights come on, kind of thing. And in a small town, you could do that. So that's why it was very much an outdoor experience for me. But if you were to go back more than 60 years to Orillia and talk to this kid and say, do you know that one day, next slide, do you know that one day the town of Orillia is going to hang a banner on their main street?
Look at that.
As in the Hall of Fame, Orillia, he wouldn't believe that. Or next slide, if you were to tell him that, 13 universities across the country are going to call him doctor, an honorary doctorate, he wouldn't believe that. And the next slide, if you were to tell him that one day the governor general was going to hang a medal around his neck, he wouldn't believe any of that. And the reason, the next slide, is because this kid, here I am being introduced to a cat by my older brother, Leo. We grew up believing that we were not good enough. We weren't like the other people on the block. We were low income. We didn't live in poverty, but we were, I guess, the poor people on the block. We couldn't take vacations. We couldn't go to Disneyland or anything like that. We couldn't go to restaurants because, well, next slide. My father, who was very debonair and dressed well, here he is with my brother Leo again. He looked good on Sundays, but for the rest of the week, he was an alcoholic. He was a very serious alcoholic and had trouble holding on to jobs. So that's one of the reasons we didn't have much of an income. And that alcohol actually took his life at the age of 55. So that was the house that I grew up in. So home to me was a place to be from. I didn't know who I would see when I came home, whether it was Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, and very often it was Mr. Hyde. So being outside was really important to me. I spent a lot of time outdoors and a lot of time alone, and I'm okay with that. And that continued throughout my life. But that feeling of not being good enough, that gets to you. You feel like you're subpar, and I've carried that with me my whole life. And next slide. So this kid, that was the attitude that we grew up with, that we, myself and my three siblings, that were just not as good as everybody else. However, I've managed to overcome that, the imposter syndrome, as they say. Next slide. My first big, I guess, pat on the back was when I was in high school, and our high school put on a play, and we entered a competition in Ontario that back then was called the Simpsons Drama Festival. And it's an Ontario-wide competition for high school students. Our school did not win Best Play, but I won Best Actor. And it was the first time in my life that I was the best at something. And it was a huge boost. Like, wow, I did something right. I did something good. And I thought I was going to be an actor because they told me I was good at it. And I did a lot of acting, both in high school and my early university years. But when I thought about it, doing it professionally, that meant that I would have to audition. I would have to compete with other people who were probably better than me. And this feeling of not being good enough, I didn't think I could stand the rejection if I didn't get a part. And so I kind of stayed away from that, even though I thought I might be good at it. Next slide. So I joined the Air Cadets with my best friend, Jerry. And another thing happened when I did that. The very first night, when we joined the Air Cadets, when you're in your civvies clothes and you're a new recruit, the very first thing the drill sergeant said to us, he said, "I don't care who you are, who your parents are, where you come from, how rich or poor you are. You're all scum. And I thought, hey, a level playing field. Everybody else is like me. This is great. And he said, if you do what you're told, learn the ropes, you can get stripes on your arm and you can tell other people they're scum. Well, if you look closely there on the right, you can see there are stripes on my arm. I got some rank in the Air Cadets. And again, that was a feeling of, if you're like everybody else, then that was great. Next slide. But this is what I ended up doing. When I dropped out of university, I was not a very good student. I was never good. I worked on billboards and constructed them around Toronto. So I was a construction worker. But then after doing that for a while, I heard that the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto was looking for demonstrators, people to stand their hair up on end and freeze flowers in liquid nitrogen, do the shows. And I've always liked science. I grew up in the space age. I watched all the moon landings and I like science. I just wasn't good at doing it. But here was an opportunity to combine theater and science together. And I thought that'd be great. And I had visited the Science Center and I love the place. So I took some company time, and I drove my truck to the Science Center. And I met John Fowles, the guy who was hiring. And I just went in and I met him. I said, I'd love to work here. This is a fabulous place. And I talked his ear off. And after a few minutes, he just stopped. He said, you're the kind of person we'd like to have here. And he hired me on the spot, just on enthusiasm. And so here I am at the Science Center. Next slide. Now, don't laugh at that, because I'm sure you have pictures like this at home somewhere, right? Anyway, this is in the 1970s, and that changed my life. I went from a blue collar with my name on my chest to a white lab coat, wowing audiences with science and all these great demonstrations. And then out of that came the media. And that started in 1976 when a robot landed on Mars called Viking. And I was following that. In fact, I developed a program at the Science Center about it. And the CBC called up and said, can somebody come on and talk about this thing on the news tonight? I said, yeah, I can do that. So I went on the news and I brought some pictures from Mars. I said, hey, this is really great. We landed on Mars. Here's what it looks like. First time we can see what it looks like to stand on another planet, blah, 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 blah. And then afterwards, they said, thank you very much. And I was just getting off the set. I was taking off the microphone, we're getting off the set. And the director came down from the control room and she stood right in front of me with her hands on her hips. And she looked at me and she said, you're really good on camera. If you want to come back and do more science stuff for us, we'll have you. And then she left. And I went, okay. and I'm still doing it now. They still call me up once in a while. Can you come on and talk? So that's the story of my life. Just opportunities came along. CBC's looking for a host for a kids television show called Wonderstruck. Give them a call. I did that for 6 years. Quirks and Quarks is looking for a host. Give them a call. Okay. So just all these things happen. So I put this all down in the book to give you an idea of just how things have evolved. But it all started just in small town Orillia, a kid who didn't think he was good enough.
It's really an amazing story and a wonderful read. And one of the things I loved about your book, Bob, and thanks for that slideshow. That was really cool to see. One of the things I loved is how you kind of found a way to weave lessons about life and science throughout your own life journey. I'm curious, before you sat down to write the book, did you know that you were going to have all these lessons weaving in and out? Was that part of your plan, or did it emerge as you wrote?
No, it was a very cathartic experience to write about myself, because I've always written about science. I've included myself in my books. I like putting personal stories in there to make it more interesting, so it's not just the boring science. But it's the first time that I've had to look back, and some of it was hard to write, and it made me really think about my life and how I got here, because it's still miraculous to me that it all happened. I didn't plan any of it. It all just fell out of the sky, and I just took advantage of these opportunities. And I don't think I'm anyone special. We all have that happen. People say, hey, why don't you try that? But it's really easy to say no. But what you're really doing is just saying, I'm scared to do it. And I don't know where I got the courage to do that. I did have some people in my teens who gave me a pat on the back and said, hey, you can do it, Bob. And that makes a big difference. But yeah, it was a journey of discovery, going back and looking at my own life and chronicling it in detail and remembering things that I hadn't thought about in a long time. So it's very cathartic.
Mm-hmm. In the opening of the book, you describe quite an emotional scene of receiving your first honorary doctorate and how you'd never seen your name before in a university diploma. And you talk about the fact that you had a different kind of learning style and you struggled in school. I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit more about that. What was your learning style?
Well, I I remember things that I'm told. I remember stories. I have a huge capacity for bad jokes. Um, I won't tell any here, but I can remember jokes right back to my childhood. And
Bad jokes welcome.
yeah, uh, the doctor says, I've got some bad news and some terrible news. Says, what's the bad news? You've only got a week to live. He said, that's awful. What's the terrible news? I've been trying to call you for 6 days, but I'm punched. So that kind of, I have a huge capacity for that. So I remember things that I'm told, and I remember things that I see or experience. So I'm very visually oriented. But words on a page don't work as well for me. I've had to almost learn to read. I have to do it now for Quirks, of course. But as a kid, we didn't have many books around, and so I didn't do a lot of reading, and I found school difficult. So I barely got by. My report cards were always saying Bobby could do better, because my average would be like 55, maybe a 60. I felt I was doing well if I got a 60 on my score. So I just barely got through. But I was good at writing essays, and I had a gift of the gab, I guess. So as a student, I just wasn't a good student at all. In fact, I failed grade 10 and had to go to summer school. And I also didn't have role models for good education. In fact, when my dad died when I was in he died when I was in grade 11, but in grade 10 that summer, my dad said, if you pass this year, you don't have to go back, because I was already better educated than he was. He only went to grade 8. My mother only went to grade 5. So I just didn't have, good study habits at home or anything like that. I'm not making excuses. I'm not blaming everything on my parents, but I just wasn't good at it. I don't know. But I was interested in the world. During the space program, I knew all the names of the astronauts. I watched all the moon landings, not just the first one. And so I can remember things that I see, but academically, the way things are taught for me just didn't work right. So I found other ways to learn. And now I hear stories. That's the beauty thing about doing Quirks. People tell me their stories every week from around the world, and it's wonderful.
I think this is a really important thing for youth to understand, that there are these different learning styles, because sometimes in the school system it's quite a narrow learning model. Do you have any words for young kids that might be struggling in school in terms of just some perspective?
Well, follow your curiosity, follow what you're interested in. And now there are so many ways to learn about everything with YouTubes and social media and whatnot. So just follow your dreams. Because every opportunity that I took advantage of was something I wanted to do. And I took on I took on a couple of bad jobs when I was a kid, and I had to pay my way through school because my parents couldn't afford it. So I worked as a janitor for a while. I worked in factories, just to make money. But ultimately, you got to pursue your own dreams. And I also have a message for teachers. If you see a student who's struggling and who's not doing, but they do something right, even something small, give them a pat on the back and say, hey, that was really good. Because that's just jet fuel. It's jet fuel for a kid who doesn't feel, why am I even doing this? I'm not as good as anybody else. And it can become self-defeating. But if you get a little pat on the back and someone says, hey, you just did something well. Wow. Okay. And that gives you confidence to keep going. So to teachers, just encourage your students. So just encourage them. Say you did well. That means a lot.
Yeah. This feeling of imposter syndrome that you touched on and not good enough. I mean, we all experience that in different ways. How have you confronted that? How have you dealt with that?
Well, for a good part of my career, I just hid the fact that I wasn't well educated. I never said I was a scientist, and yet I would get invited to speak at scientific conferences. So there I am up on the podium, and a whole big auditorium or a conference hall full of scientists, and I'm giving a keynote speech, and I would say to myself, what am I? I'm the least educated person in the room. What am I doing up here? But then I realized that I wasn't going to teach them science. When I give talks at science conferences, I can't tell them anything they don't already know. But what I can give them is my perspective as a journalist, what I see as a journalist, how I see science, because I see all the subjects. And so I have a perspective on that. So that's what I'll talk about, is my perspective on science. And they really want to hear that. So I don't claim to be an expert in anything. And I just kind of kept that off to the side. Now I'm not afraid to say that, okay, well, I'm sort of self-educated, and people actually find that kind of interesting. I'm not promoting it as a way to go. It's good to stay with the education system, get a good education, but there are many ways of learning, as you say. So I did have to struggle with that, but to beat it, I would just make sure that what I'm saying is true, and that I'm not making things up.
Right. And you say you're more on the side of the public than the side of the scientists, and your job is to be like a translator. Is that right?
That's correct. I'm between the scientists and the public, and yeah, science has its own language that's very specific and often very convoluted, especially in medicine. You get these. When I first started out, I had to learn about bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which is related to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. I don't even know what I just said, but that's mad cow disease, which was a big deal in the early 90s in England. But I had to learn that. And so the scientists talk like that to each other, and they need precision. That's why they do that. So then I have to learn what that means and then translate that into something that the public can understand. So that's very much my job. And in many ways, I think by not having a PhD myself, that helps me be closer to the public side. Because if I was an expert like they are, the conversation could become very inside and we start talking to each other. I'd be talking to the scientist like another scientist. But instead, I'm just a curious guy. I want to know what you did. What did you find out? Why is this important? How do you feel about it? What are you going to do next? Those kind of questions. And try to keep it in that type of language so that the public can understand. Because I'm not handing out PhDs. We're just trying to inform the public. Here's what happened in science this week. I want to tell you about it. And it's really neat. It's new stuff. We didn't know this before, but now we just found out something new. And it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's some new black hole out at the edge of the universe or a new gene that they found in our DNA that might help cure disease, or I don't know, creative sex life of an insect or something. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's all new. So you're right. That is my job, is to be a translator between the scientists and the public.
And you mentioned curiosity before for kids and how important that is. How much has curiosity and enthusiasm informed your role?
Oh, that's everything. I mean, that's what science is. Science is curiosity, and kids are naturally curious. That's why I've spent a good part of my career working with kids. They're naturally curious. They want to know about the world around them. So does science. And science is just a very organized way of doing that. So science always starts out with a question. Why is the sky blue? Well, we had to figure that out. There was this guy named Rayleigh who worked out that, well, there's water vapor and dust and stuff in the sky, and it scatters light, and the blue light is scattered the most, so that's why the sky's blue during the day. You go to Mars, the sky's pink because it doesn't have the same ingredients that we do. It's all dust, so it's pink on Mars. Oh, isn't that neat? So science answers questions like that. How did the universe begin? We still don't know the answer to that. How did life begin on planet Earth? We don't know that either. We think we got theories, but we really don't know. So it's naturally curious, and that's what I find interesting about it. And if we can keep kids interested in it, then maybe they'll get on. And I think that's really important, to have a scientifically somewhat literate society, because a lot of the issues that we're dealing with right now, climate change, water issues, droughts, forest fires, population, food, water, they're all scientific concepts. And if we're going to come up with solutions to those problems, we need to understand the science and the solutions that science is presenting to us. But if you have conspiracy theories that are talking to you, or climate deniers or putting out misinformation, you may not know the difference between the real science and the pseudoscience, which is a big issue we're facing right now. So, yeah, it's important for curiosity to be satisfied both through kids and through the scientific method.
How do you suggest that we develop our discernment about what's true and what's not true in this age where there's so much information, and of course we end up being in an echo chamber with social media, the algorithms, the way they work?
Yeah, I have a big problem with that. When I started out in media, the only way that you could get something on television was to work through producers, and the producers would work with you, fact check, help you with it, make sure that it's correct before we put it out. And we still do that at the CBC. We make sure that we're accurate as we can possibly be. Whereas now, anyone with an opinion can put out a YouTube video or social media. So what you have to do is ask, who is saying this? If they're saying something outrageous, like the earth is flat, well, then who are they? Are they from an institute like UBC or one of our centers of excellence in Canada? Or are they from an institute that they created and made themselves the head of it? And are they putting out an opinion, or are they presenting evidence? So that's where you have to be careful, and you have to really find out who's saying it. If who's saying it is a professor at UBC and this is their research and they can back that up with evidence that they found, then yeah, they're searching for the truth. And science is one of the few institutions we have left that searches for the truth. The law is supposed to do that, but the law it still does, but it's morphed into who wins. How can you win? How can you get your case dismissed or get around it or find some way to get out of it? We're seeing a lot of that in the States right now. But science, in its purest form, is simply trying to get to the truth. How does the universe work? So check your sources. And if somebody says, I don't believe something, you can believe whatever you like, but that's not science. That's an opinion. Science doesn't work on opinions. Science works on evidence and building up on facts.
Yes. What role do you think that maybe corporate and other vested interests funding research and education play in this?
Well, it's becoming more and more important. And the issue there is that if corporations are going to fund our universities, and they do, that the university doesn't become a corporate lab, so that whatever science the university comes up with, the corporation owns proprietary rights. Because our universities, the public science that's done should be public. And so there's always that conundrum there for the universities. They want to accept the money, but they don't want to give up the science to the corporation. And so there's always that tricky balance. But I think most of our universities are managing to get by with that. The thing about corporations, and I'm not knocking corporate science, it's all great, but it's very tightly focused, and it's trying to make something better. You got a product, you want to make it better, or you've got a drug you're trying to develop, and you want to make it work as well as possible. But that's applied science. That's the kind of science that gives us things like the internet and our cell phones and household appliances, whatever. But there's another kind of science, which is the basic science. And that's the science where you don't know what you're going to get. You're just asking a fundamental question. How did the universe begin? How does it work? What's something about nature that we don't understand yet that we want to figure out? And sometimes people will say, well, why are you doing that? Why do you care about the sex life of some insect in Borneo? Well, that's fundamental science. And out of that, you don't know what's going to happen. But all of the practical science, all the applied science that we have came out of the basic stuff. So we couldn't develop telephones or cell phones until we understood electricity and how electricity works and how magnetism works together, how the two of them work together. Well, that goes back more than 150 years to basic science, trying to understand stuff like that. So we have to keep that alive as well. And that doesn't have a payback right away. You're not going to get a product out of it that you can make money on yet, but future generations might. So we have to keep both alive.
Yeah. I'm very curious to hear your opinion. There's a lot of different voices saying, talking about cancel culture and loss of free speech and that kind of thing. How do you address? Have you seen any real danger of open discourse and dissent being shut down in the public conversation around science?
Well, I'm all for free speech. What bothers me is when you have, say, a scientist who has years of evidence behind them to say something. Let me take climate change as for an example. So you'll have someone who has all this evidence, and there's a huge amount of evidence that climate change is real. And then you put them up against someone who just says, I don't believe it, or who has cherry picked evidence and represented it in the wrong way. And you give them equal time as though they're equal experts, and they're not. They're not. And so that makes it look like the one who has the opinion is just as valid as the scientist who has an entire university behind them, or a whole community behind them. And sometimes it looks like they're equal. And so you can have the free speech, but how do you
How do we
how do you,
present it? How do we package it?
yeah, in a way that's a true representation. It's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing to do. Um, again, it's evidence versus belief. You can believe in unicorns. You can believe in aliens among us. You can believe whatever you like, but show me evidence. Show me the evidence. I only believe. I've been doing science journalism for so long now. I want to see evidence. And very often when I ask people, they'll say, "Oh, I don't believe they landed on the moon." I say, "Well, why don't you believe that?" And then they'll come up with reasons that are just not valid. I find out that what they're really doing is displaying their ignorance. They don't understand some fundamental concepts. So they put together their own conclusions based on limited information. And that can happen a lot. People, a little bit of information is dangerous. Well, scientists have a lot of information. And scientists don't say they know something until they've really, really proven it with a lot of time and effort. So again, know your sources, find out who's talking. And it is a quagmire right now. There's so much stuff out there that it's upon the public to know, to do a little research and find out who's telling the truth.
I just want to remind our live audience we'll be getting to some of your questions in a little bit here for Bob. So go ahead and keep them coming in the chat on YouTube. Bob, I wonder if we can circle back to your childhood and just talk about a serious issue that you've come out about publicly, about your father. You wrote that the alcohol not only polluted his mind, but cast a pall over our entire family. I'm wondering if you can just share whatever you feel comfortable with about your father.
Yeah, I have never ever gone public with this. This is the first time that I've come out about it. But well, there's no easy way to say it. I was sexually abused by my father, and I was sexually abused a second time by a stranger, a teenage boy who was much larger than me when I was 9 years old. So the first incidents with my dad, I was, I think, 7 or 8. And then I was 9, I think, when the second one happened, in a park, not in Aurelia, it was in another city. And the reason that I've written about this in my book is I'm not looking for sympathy or pity or anything, but I'm reaching out to anyone who has suffered child abuse from any form, that I'm a living example that you can get over it. You can get past it, that you don't have to allow something traumatic that happened to you as a child to ruin the rest of your life. Because if you do, you're giving more power to the abuser. Even though they might be dead, they're still influencing you, and they don't deserve that power. So what I've done is I put those memories, which will never go away. And it was hard writing about them in this book because I can still remember every second of it in detail. I locked them away in a deep part of my memory in a mental vault. and I lock the door, and only I have the key, and I don't open it. And I don't use it as a crutch or as an excuse for bad behavior. I make my own choice about my life. We make choices about our lives. You say yes to the things you want to do and let it go. So that's my message to, and I've been overwhelmed by the number of people who have written into me saying, thank you for coming out about this. Now I know I'm not alone. This is grossly underreported. In my day, nobody talked about it. Both my parents knew about it. I mean, my mother came in and broke it up, but they didn't talk about it. I never let my dad come near me for the rest of his life. And it's just not reported. So there are a lot of people out there who are struggling with this, but you can do it. You just find a way to put it away and get on with your life, because that was then, this is now. And now is where we live. We're not those children anymore. I know that it's affected me in some ways, some subtle ways throughout my life as I look back, but not in serious, devastating ways. It hasn't crippled me. I've gotten beyond it and feel stronger because of that. So that's my message to all of you out there who are dealing with childhood abuse. You can put it away and use the rest of your brain to make good decisions about your life and move ahead. So that's why I wrote about that.
Thank you so much, Bob. I really have a lot of respect for you speaking about this and bringing awareness to it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about, but it's yeah, if I can help some people, then it's worth it for me.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sure it's helping a lot of people. You told the story when you were sharing the slideshow about the first big opportunity you had where you really said yes, and that was when you got the opportunity to apply for a job at the Ontario Science Centre. Can you tell us how did you go from that to ending up on Quirks and Quarks? I know there's a lot in between there, but can you give us a little bit of a snapshot of how that led you to where you're at now?
Well, as I said, the CBC News asked me to come on and talk about this thing that landed on Mars. So did CTV on their morning show the following morning. And I went on there and they said, hey, you're good. Do you want to come back and do science? I said, sure. Then Global TV did the same thing. So suddenly I was appearing on all three networks as a science guy, and they all loved it. And I kept feeding them stories, or they'd call me up if something happened in the news, and I became a regular. And word got out that there's this guy who can come on camera, show pictures, do demonstrations, be fun. I mean, that's what we did at the Science Center, was to make science fun and entertaining. So I just carried that over into television. And then people would see me on television. So I got a phone call one day right out of the blue at home. And this guy said, hi, I'm a television producer from New York City. I was in Toronto and I saw you on the morning show. You're really good. Do you make your own videos? Just short little 2-minute science news items? Because if you do, I'll buy them. I run a news network and I'll run them on my network. Now, at the time, I didn't produce television. And again, at this time, this is before YouTube and home cameras and cell phones and all that. And, but I thought, wow, this is an opportunity, break into the States. So I said, yes. He said, great. Here's my number in New York. You do all the production in Toronto. I want 2 of them a week, any topic, doesn't matter. And fire me the videotapes by FedEx, and we'll run them on our network. Here's my number. Give me a call. Got to go. Bye. And I went, holy cow, this is incredible. But then I thought, what have I done? I don't know how to do this. How am I going to do this? But I was appearing on a lot of programs. And so I was going to call him back and say, look, I can't really do it. But instead, I called a cameraman that I worked with at Global Television. We'd become friends. And I told him what had just happened. And he said, oh, I can shoot those on my days off. I've got all the equipment. We can shoot those on my days off. And he said, and I have a friend who's an editor, and he's got a side business out of his living room, so he can cut them together. So the 3 of us formed a company, and we produced 78 of those little 2-minute videos that ran across the United States. So suddenly I own a production company. So that's the kind of thing that happened. I had another American come up and said, we're doing a big series. Would you like to be the host and the writer of it? And I said, yes. And I started producing these. I've done as many educational videos in the States as I have done here in Canada. Most people don't know that.
I didn't.
But I was writing and producing all of these stuff, these things coming out of Waco, Texas, and Dallas, Texas, and Seattle, and doing work in the States. So that's the story. It just came along. And then a friend of mine said, CBC is looking for a host for a children's series in the 80s called Wonderstruck. And so I went and met the producer, and so they hired me for that. And so it's just been opportunities that have come along. I freelanced for a while. When I was doing more and more stuff while I was at the Science Center, I was really liking it. And my job at the Science Center had kind of plateaued. I was there for 6 years, and I was still doing the same stuff. So I gathered all my bosses together, and I said, I'm thinking of leaving and becoming a freelance journalist. Can you entice me to stay? And they said, well, because you don't have a teaching certificate and you don't have a university degree, we can't promote you to the next level. You'd have to go back to school and get a degree. Then we can put you up to the next level. And I said, thank you very much. Then I went and I wrote my letter of resignation. And then I threw myself out into the wild blue as a freelance science journalist for almost 10 years, doing all this other stuff. So it's, again, just some opportunities came to me, some I made for myself. And if you don't mind, one more example.
Please.
In 1995, I went to the documentary unit, the head of the documentary unit at the National on CBC television. And I stood in the doorway, and I knew the guy who was the head of it. And I said, Daniel, there's this Canadian astronaut named Chris Hadfield. He's going to go up on a Russian space station. He's training in Moscow right now. We have to do a documentary on him because he's going to be big. This is a big story, and I need to do it for you. And he went, oh, never heard of the guy. He said, write up a one-pager, and I'll take it up to management. The next thing I know, I'm on a plane to Moscow with a television producer, and we followed Chris around on his very first flight to space, which was up to the Mir space station, the Russian space station. That's the predecessor to the International Space Station. And we followed Chris around. We went to Star City, saw how they trained with these big modules, and it was great. And we ended up getting 2 stories out of that. So again, that was just walking in the door saying, hi, you need me to do this for you. And that really works. That works as well.
Wow, you really just created that opportunity for yourself.
Yeah, I've done that a couple times. Yeah.
Wow. Maybe it's one of the things you've already said, but I'm curious, what was one of the biggest or scariest or most maybe impossible seeming opportunities that presented itself to you?
Well, they all feel like that at the beginning. When a new one comes along, you get scared because you think, oh, I can't do this. And I have found that there's 3, and I've learned this retrospectively looking back, but there's 3 steps. First, you say yes. And then when you get scared, instead of letting the fear stop you, and that's where a lot of us will stop, is I'm too scared, I don't want to do this. You focus on the very first thing you need to do and just do that. And usually that means picking up the phone and asking somebody, how do I do this? Like I did with the cameraman. How do I make television? And he said, okay, I'll show you. So you do that. And once you do the first step, you'll see the next one. Then do that and do that and just step your way through it. And the third thing is to finish what you start. Get it done. Go all the way to the end. And you may not be the best. You probably won't. There's always someone better than you, but you get it done. And people really appreciate that. Whoever's giving you the paycheck really appreciates the fact that you got it done. And when you do, you feel stronger. The next time a challenge comes along, it's not quite so scary because it boosts you up. But if you say no, if you don't get that reward. So it's been that process. So I've been scared every time I've taken on something new and wondered if I can do it or not. But if I just nail my feet to the floor and figure out how to do that by asking somebody, then yeah. I came back from a space mission in California. It was a mission to Saturn. And I was down there covering it. And I'd already told the CBC about it. And they said, sure, we'll take it. But while I was there, the public relations person from NASA came up to me with this big bundle of photographs and press material. She said, are you interested in Venus? I said, yeah. She said, yeah, nobody seems to care about Venus. We sent a robot to Venus with a radar that's seen through the clouds of Venus. These are the first maps of Venus. I said, that's historic. We've never seen through the clouds of Venus. We don't know what it looks like. She said, yeah, nobody seems to care. Here, give it. So I thought, wow, this is amazing. And at that time, the Globe and Mail had a science page every Thursday. And I figured they're going to cover this. This is a big story. And when I came back to Toronto, I went and I got a Globe and Mail on Thursday, and I opened up the science page and it wasn't there. So I called the Globe and Mail general number. I said, do you have a science editor? They said, yeah. I get this guy on the phone. I said, are you doing anything on Pioneer Venus? He said, what's that? I said, what's that? Are you kidding? Well, I just came back from NASA. We got the first photographs. You should be doing it. And he said, why don't you do it? I'm really busy. Write it up, send it in. If I don't like it, I'll publish the photos and give you a credit. I got to go. Bye. So here I have an opportunity to write for the Globe and Mail. I'd never written for newspapers, and I didn't know anything about it. I thought, who am I to write for our national newspaper? I've never done this. So again, I wanted to say no, but I knew somebody who worked in print. So I called them up and I said, is there a formula for newspapers, a structure that they use? And she said, yeah, there's this thing called the inverted pyramid. It's a structure they use. So she described that to me. And okay, so I went home and I wrote Venus Revealed, and I wrote up a story. Then I went to the Globe and Mail and I met the guy. And I said, hi, I'm the guy with the Venus story. Here are the pictures. Here's my story. Here's why it's important. He said, okay, I'll get back to you. Well, I didn't hear back from him. And I thought, he hated it. How can I think I could write this stuff? And I didn't hear back from him at all. The next Thursday, I went and I got a Globe and Mail. I opened it up. The whole top page of the Globe and Mail science section was Venus Revealed, Bob McDonald. The whole article was there. So I called him back. I said, hey, thanks for publishing my article. He said, you're welcome. Do you have any more? Yeah, okay. So I started writing for the Globe and Mail. He never said, who are you? Where did you go to school? What were your grades? I had an idea. I walked in with an idea, and that works. That works. So I use that method too. And sometimes you say yes, sometimes you make other people say yes.
That's fantastic. I love that. Is it okay, Bob? There's some good questions rolling in from the audience. Can we tend to some? Okay. This is right on what we're talking about right now. Karen wrote in and said, I heard this recently. The more you do things that feel difficult, the more you build that muscle, and trying difficult things becomes easier.
Couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. It's a self-reinforcing process, and it does give you. But just remember, you will get scared again, but you'll have more strength to climb that next mountain. But if you don't, it's a downward spiral, and you just go down and down, and you end up doing nothing. And that's very dangerous, where you lose your self-confidence totally. So even small things, get them done. Just finish what you start. It's so important. You feel so good when you get something done. We all do that. You got something in the back of your head that you've been procrastinating on. I'm a master procrastinator. I've got to really discipline myself. And but once you do that, you find, okay, I'm finally going to do that thing. I'm going to paint the garage or whatever the hell. It doesn't matter what it is. And you get it done and you feel so good afterwards. Hey, okay, all right, time to go reward myself. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It does give you strength, builds that muscle. I like that.
Yeah. There's a question from Sabina who says, often kids ask, why do I need to know that? They often choose courses in high school that are easy and they don't need to work hard to pass. How to teach curiosity for teachers and parents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, when you're a kid, it's easy because you've got a parent who'll do things for you, so you can take the easy path. But when you become an adult, you have to take your life into your own hands. Now you're the adult. And if you don't learn the skills of how to get things done when you're a kid, then you won't know how to do that when you're an adult. So how are you going to manage a business? How are you going to manage money? How are you going to be a politician? How are you going to be whatever the career is that you decide to do if you don't have the skills of learning something, learning how to do something, and finishing it? So taking the easy way out only works so far. But when it comes to, if you look at people who have really accomplished in their lives and really done well, they worked hard to do that. It didn't come easy for them. And so, it's fun when you're a kid to take it easy, but that's not the way to learn. You got to feed your mind. You got to feed your brain too. You got to exercise it, just like you have to exercise your body. And when you're not learning, when somebody else is doing it for you, or you're getting all your information off your phone, but it's not really sinking in, you're not equipping yourself with tools to handle new things that come along. So yeah, learn things. There's a phrase that I've heard, information rich, knowledge poor. So we're awash in information in our devices. The information just flows out. But how much of it is sticking? How much do you actually know? Do you know fundamentals? Do you know some of the basic stuff about how things work? Or do you just know a lot of information? There's a big difference between those two. So knowledge is really what works. Get to the basics.
Yes. There's a question here from Vancouver Life that says, what do you think the impact of AI, chat GPT, et cetera, will be on learning and doing new things?
Yeah. I'm a little concerned about that. Artificial intelligence is a powerful, powerful tool, and it's really helping science. It's helping scientists deal with large amounts of data, and AI sees patterns that humans don't see. So it's really great at picking that out, especially in medical science and trying to find causes of diseases or patterns in disease and whatnot. So scientifically, it's a very powerful tool, but it can make us lazy mentally if you rely on the chat GPT to write your essays, for example. Now, fortunately, there are programs that can identify that so that professors and teachers know that you're using it. But I like to think about, my generation, we had to learn how to add and subtract in school in your head. You had to learn all the times tables and do all of that. Then calculators came along, and now in your phone, you don't have to add and subtract anymore. It does it for you. And so we've lost that skill of addition and arithmetic. Same with driving. You have to learn how to drive a car. Well, now cars are getting smarter. They can drive themselves. They can park. Well, as soon as the technology does it for it, you lose that skill. When it comes to creativity, that's the mind. We're using our mind to think and try to create things. But if you have a machine do it for you, you're not learning anything. All you're doing is just handing in something that you hope will get you a grade so you can get through. But what do you have at the end? You don't have any more knowledge. The purpose of doing these things in school is to teach you to think. That's all that school does. It teaches you how to think logically, how to solve problems, how to carry on an intelligent conversation. It's not about getting a grade and getting out with an A+ so that you think you can get a job. I actually had the head of technology at the CBC a number of years ago come to me, and he said, Bob, you got to teach these kids some science. He said, we're getting young people coming out of our technical colleges to work here at the CBC, and they get in front of a big control board with all the sliders and the buttons and everything else on it. He said, they know how to push the buttons, but they don't know how it works. They don't understand fundamentals. We're having to reteach them. We're having to give them courses on how these things work so they'll understand when something goes wrong. He said, the schools aren't doing that. So that's the point. You don't want to come out of university or school having a great grade, but you don't know anything, or you haven't learned much because the machine did it for you. So that worries me a lot. That worries me a lot.
Yeah, I hear you on that. We've got another question here from Coral, who is asking, is there a special moment on Quirks and Quarks that completely changed your worldview?
My worldview? Wow. Well, there've been a couple. In 1999, as we were coming up to the change of the millennium, we had a special show about that. And there was a conference in Toronto where Dr. Polanyi from the University of Toronto, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, invited some other Nobel laureates to come to Toronto. And we intercepted them on the way to the event to come into my studio and talk about the future. Well, how did they see the new millennium? So here I am sitting in my studio, and I had 5 gentlemen. Unfortunately, they were all men. There were no women, but 5 men in tuxedos. And each one of them had won the Nobel Prize in a different area of science. And they're talking to me. And that was a pinch me moment. How did I get here? How did this happen? And here are these, world experts talking about their perception on how science was going to proceed. And that was a big learning moment for me. that I'm in a very privileged position to do what I do, to have people like that talk to me and try to give a sense of where science is and where it's going in medicine and in physics and in geology and all the different topics that they went about. There was also a moment during the 90s, the late 90s, where there was some new evidence from the Hubble Space Telescope about how old the universe is, about how fast it's expanding. And there was a mistake that the scientific community made. They thought the universe was younger than some of the stars that are in it. We know how old stars are. So how can you have stars that are older than the universe itself? It was a conundrum. And they were all mixed up about that. And they had to resolve that and realize that the way they were measuring the universe was wrong. And that made me realize that we still don't know. There's still so much we don't know about fundamental stuff that we think we've got it right. And then a new instrument comes along, like the Hubble Space Telescope, or now the James Webb Telescope, and it changes our perspective on things. Hey, we're not quite right. We're not totally wrong, but we're not quite right. We have to modify that. And that shows me how the process of science itself works. It's self-correcting. You gather the evidence that you have, and you come to a level of knowledge, and you say, okay, I think I got this figured out. But then down the line, somebody else comes along, the next generation, with a new instrument or a new way of thinking, and you think, oh, okay, and then that builds, and it builds, and it builds. We have 2,000 years of this happening. So that was a moment for me that science is an evolving subject, that it's always changing and always growing, and there's still a lot we don't know, and that's what makes it interesting for me and keeps it endlessly entertaining.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I just want to share a comment first from the audience. Annie said, "Bob's curiosity and joy are contagious, and this talk has so inspired me. I have thoughts flowing into my brain of dormant ideas that I now want to dust off and try." Thank you, Bob.
Go for it. By all means, go for it.
You were just talking about, how science is constantly refining and shifting, and there's a question from Larry who's asking, what are the most hopeful areas of science you see coming along?
Well, one of them is the future of green energy. My last book that I wrote before this one was called "The Future is Now: Solving the Climate Crisis with Today's Technologies." And in that book, I talk about the amazing fact, the reassuring fact, that all the technology we need to produce energy without changing the environment already exists. We know how to capture the free energy that falls out of the sky from the sun. It blows on the wind. It bubbles out of the ground. There's no shortage of energy around us. And we have the technology to gather that up and continue our lifestyle, keep the lights on without contaminating the atmosphere. And I'm looking forward to moving into that. We're slowly moving towards that, but we're not there yet, so that we can curb this rising global emissions that we're doing right now. So I'm really looking forward to that from a technological point of view. From a pure basic science point of view, I'm fascinated by two of the biggest mysteries in the universe: dark energy and dark matter. And when scientists say dark, that means I don't know. They don't know what it is. So dark matter is this stuff that's out there in the universe that we don't know what it is, but we know it's there because it has gravity. It affects how things move. Dark energy is causing the universe to speed up as it expands. And those two things, dark energy and dark matter, make up 95% of the universe. So what we see with our greatest telescopes and what we see with our eyes when we look into it is only 5% of what's really there. It's the black that the universe is made of, and we haven't got a clue what that is. And there's a lot of work going on right now to find out. And when we do, who knows what will come out of that, because that's the fundamental workings of the universe itself. And so I'm kind of looking forward to that. That and the development of warp drive, so we can start hopping around the galaxy like the Starship Enterprise. I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah.
I love Star Trek.
Me too.
Nice. Ladies and gentlemen, folks, we've been speaking to Bob McDonald, beloved host of Quirks and Quarks, about his new book, a memoir, just say yes. It's been a real privilege and honor to speak with you, Bob. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ross. It's been a real pleasure for me too. And thanks everyone for listening in. It's been great.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.